A road rage incident transformed a young couple's journey home from the pub into a macabre and brutal tale of jealousy and anger.
We were just followed and chased.
And the ending was truly horrifying.
It wasn't just one stab to the heart, it was 37 stab wounds.
Here was a road rage incident which had ended up in a murder.
With few clues and no leads, the police turned to the grief-stricken survivor, who made a touching appeal to her fiancé's killer.
And all I want to say is, please, you're the driver of the car, just come forward.
The campaign, the police launch was huge, and seemed they were drawing a blank. Nothing or no one seemed to fit.
But when the pieces of the puzzle finally started falling into place, those investigating began to wonder just whose rage had left a young man dead on the roadside.
We got angry, and of course that anger blazed.
The 2nd of December 1996. At 3:20 a.m, Maureen and Ray Harvey were woken up by a car pulling up outside their home in the suburbs of Birmingham. Maureen assumed it was her son, Lee.
I heard a car pull up outside, and at first I thought, oh, here we go again.
The 25-year-old frequently came back to his parents' house after fights with his fiancée.
The couple were often splitting up. Lee would often leave and come back again, and it was quite a regular pattern.
But the car outside wasn't Lee's.
I woke my husband and I said, there's a police car outside, and basically they asked if we were the parents of Lee Harvey, and just somebody was screaming, and it's obviously me.
The police told the Harveys that Lee and his fiancée, Tracie Andrews, had been assaulted as they'd driven home from the local pub. Only it was no ordinary assault, according to what Tracie had told detectives at the scene.
They said that there'd been a road rage.
You have this good-looking young lady driving home with her fiancé, and somebody races him down the road, pulls in front of him and stabs him.
It was every mother's worst fear.
I said, but he's not dead, he's not dead. And the lady policeman, she just put her arms around me, and that was the answer.
Tracie had also been injured, but not critically.
They said, oh, she has got injuries and that she's been treated in hospital.
And that's when Lee's dad asked a question, one the police were still trying to answer themselves.
Why would somebody stab Lee and leave her alive as a witness?
When Tracie Andrews and Lee Harvey had met in a Birmingham nightclub in October 1994, the attraction was instantaneous.
She was young and glamorous, and Lee was also young and glamorous.
But the connection between the 26-year-old barmaid and the 24-year-old bus conductor was more than just a casual fling.
Straight in, they were madly in love, wouldn't leave each other alone, and obviously it was the sex. And, and it was like they couldn't get enough of each other.
Tracie hit it off with Lee's mother, Maureen, straight away.
Within 20 minutes of meeting her, I thought, what a lovely-looking girl.
Maureen also sensed something else beneath Tracie's lovely looks.
She was very insecure about herself, and I couldn't understand why. But then she went on to tell me her life story.
When Tracie was about 8, her father just literally got up and walked out the door, never to return.
Her mother had later remarried, and while she got on with her stepfather, Tracie told Maureen she never got over her father's betrayal.
It obviously scarred her, and she was very hurt.
She wasn't, however, afraid of commitment.
She wanted to settle down and get married and have a family.
And initially, in Maureen's opinion, that made Tracie a good catch for her son.
He'd got no ambition of being something special. He just wanted to be a father and a husband and have a family life.
Within weeks, Lee was spending most of his time at Tracie's flat in Alvechurch, a village just outside Birmingham. Within months, he was spending all of his time there.
It moves in quite quickly with Tracie. It was a matter of a few months.
However, settling down didn't dampen Lee and Tracie's intense relationship.
It was fiery, certainly passionate, but you know, sometimes that passion would spill into, maybe unpleasantness.
According to Lee's mother, Maureen, the unpleasantness started when Tracie's passion for Lee became possessive.
She was very demanding. She wanted to know everything about where he was, and she'd want to know every detail of his day.
Lee could be just as jealous of Tracie, often accusing her of flirting with other men.
There was a lot of jealousy on both sides. They had very heated arguments.
There were episodes where the police were sent for at the house or the flat where they were living together.
More often than not, the fights ended with Lee packing his things and moving back to his parents' house, something that deeply troubled his mother.
His personality, I could see it changing, which I didn't like, and I did warn him. And I phoned her and I told her that I wasn't happy the way she was changing my son.
However, Lee could never stay away from Tracie for long.
They had their ups and downs, lots of breakups, lots of screaming and shouting, and then lots of passionate making up.
Then, in May 1995, after 7 months of angry breakups and passionate reconciliations, Lee attempted to put their volatile relationship on a more permanent footing.
He proposed to her and gave the ring. He popped the ring on a finger.
Tracie said yes. But it soon became clear that an engagement ring hadn't changed much about Tracie and Lee's routine.
They kept saying, oh yes, we're going to get married, and then they'd have a very violent row, split up, and then they'd be back together again.
I warned her and him about it, and I said, like, you're heading for disaster.
By August 1996, the couple had been engaged off and on for over a year, with no wedding in sight. Then, Tracie made an announcement that seemed to change everything.
She's come in and she said that she was expecting and that they were thrilled and whatever, and I'm thinking, oh dear, that's it now then, if there's a baby on the way.
But barely a week had passed before Lee was back at his parents' house after yet another fight with Tracie. The separation was as short-lived as always, only it wasn't passion that brought Lee and Tracie back together this time.
She was shopping and she come down some steps and she fell, and that's when she had the miscarriage.
Tracie told Lee about the miscarriage just days after he'd walked out.
He was very upset and he was concerned about that, and he kept saying, oh, we can try for another one.
Tracie appeared equally devastated. That is, until Lee came up with a way to boost both their spirits.
He'd paid for a breast enhancement surgery.
A month after the loss of the baby, Tracie had new breasts and a new self-confidence.
She's come to dinner. The clothes were very low because obviously she wants to show off her new boobs. And she's got my husband's hand without him not knowing. And she's placed it on her breast and she says, feel that.
But it was when she and Lee went out that Tracie's exhibitionism really expressed itself.
She started getting onto the dance floor and dancing and sort of like enticing the men. And she'd just stand and dance on her own, and like, you know, because she wanted people to see her the way she moved.
But with Tracie flaunting her new assets everywhere they went, it didn't take long for Lee's jealousy to resurface.
Obviously, Lee would get upset about it. What man wouldn't? Doesn't want his girlfriend or the woman he's going to marry performing like that, so it caused problems.
But would it also cause murder? On the evening of the 1st of December 1996, Tracie and Lee headed down to the local pub for drinks. As usual, Tracie made sure she turned all the men's heads as soon as she walked into the room.
She was very noticeable. Black leather jacket, black leather trousers.
And just hours later, the police would be wondering just who had noticed Tracie in the pub that night. At around 10:45 p.m, a local man made a gruesome discovery on the isolated stretch of road outside his girlfriend's country cottage.
He heard some noises in the road outside. He went to the garden gate. He saw Tracie in a distressed and blood-stained condition.
She was discovered standing by the car with Lee on the ground, already dead.
The man took Tracie inside the cottage and called the police. When the first officers arrived, they found Lee's body in the road, lying in a pool of blood.
2 uniformed police constables attended the scene. They could see what it was. Mr. Harvey was already deceased.
Tracie was inside the cottage, covered in Lee's blood and shaken by what had just happened. However, Tracie did manage to tell the officers that shortly after she and Lee had left the pub, a car with 2 men inside had started to follow them.
This vehicle allegedly came up behind Lee Harvey's vehicle, flashing its lights, blowing its horn. There was some shouting.
Eventually, according to Tracie, the other car pulled in front, forcing them to stop. Lee and the other driver had jumped out and started arguing. Tracie said she got out to help Lee, but the other driver had knocked her to the ground.
She's got a black eye, she's got bruises, she's covered in blood.
Then, Tracie said, the passenger of the other car got out and struck Lee several times.
She thought they were punches, she said initially.
The next thing she knew, the 2 men had taken off, and Lee was on the ground.
When she gets to him, she sees how blood-stained he is. She lifts his head up, kneels down, puts it on her lap.
Tracie basically holds Lee in her arms while he dies.
In the early morning hours of Monday, the 2nd of December 1996, Tracie Andrews sat in a hospital room on the outskirts of Birmingham. Just hours earlier, her fiancé, Lee Harvey, had been stabbed to death on a country road, apparently after an altercation with another driver.
Here was a road rage incident which had ended up in a murder.
Tracie had also been beaten in the attack.
She tries to stop it, but the other guy punches her, and she had bruises and cuts around her face.
So when the West Mercia police detective Brian Russell took her statement that morning in the hospital, he didn't hope for much more information.
Normally, all I would do was take a series of notes, bearing in mind that the person is likely to be in shock, is likely to be traumatised.
Tracie, however, seemed surprisingly composed for someone who'd just watched her fiancé die.
It was only because she seemed so undisturbed, so settled. I built the statement there and then.
Tracie elaborated on what she'd said earlier at the crime scene. The whole thing had started not long after they'd left the pub.
She says Lee started swearing and looking in his mirror and on about the car behind.
Tracie described the car as a dark-coloured Ford Sierra.
This vehicle came alongside the Ford Escort. There was some shouting from the occupants inside, an attempt to pull in front but didn't quite make it because of a vehicle coming the opposite way.
Had someone followed them from the pub? Tracie said she didn't know, but she did say that the other driver stayed tight on the back of Lee's rear bumper, racing his engine and blowing the horn.
They were chased for about 3 miles through country lanes.
The chase Tracie described had been so frantic that Lee had even missed the turning that led to her home.
Lee Harvey had overshot the lane, reversed, and then done a left-hand turn.
Moments later, according to Tracie, the chase was over.
Eventually, the Ford Sierra gets in front and forces Lee off the road.
They ended up stopping in this quiet lane, and the 2 occupants of the car got out, and the passenger, who was, according to Tracie, a fat man with staring eyes, stabbed Lee. and then they got in the car and drove off.
The police immediately issued an alert for both the car and the mysterious man. Meanwhile, detectives also scoured the crime scene for clues.
When it became light, we planned search areas and that sort of thing for the possible weapon.
However, that afternoon, the search had turned up no car, no suspect, no murder weapon, and no witnesses.
It was important to check everything that she was saying, but we bottomed out, as they call it.
So the police decided to try a different tack.
They wanted Tracie to do a press conference.
It's so very well someone like me going on and saying, ladies and gentlemen, can you help? But quite clearly when someone sees the situation, they're more inclined to think, oh, well, I do know this, so I will give it a ring.
The next day, Tuesday morning, before the press conference, Detective Inspector Brian Russell took Tracie out to retrace the route that she and Lee had taken home, starting at the pub.
I was making notes of what she said. Turn left here, turn right here. This is where the car came in behind us. This is where they overtook us.
By the time they got back to the police station, the media was already waiting.
Well, it's pandemonium, you know, that every member of the media was there and sort of clamouring to get near her.
The fact she's blonde, you know, she was in her early 20s. I suppose these were all factors which made it appealing for the press.
For the press, Tracie was more than just a witness or victim. She was the tragic star in a tale the headlines had already dubbed the road rage murder.
Road rage was all the vogue at the time.
The spotlight was so intense that even Tracie, who thrived on attention in some situations, started having second thoughts.
She said, I can't do it. And I said, you are the only witness that was there. I said, like, basically, we need your help and we need to get to the bottom of this.
Tracie finally agreed. With cameras flashing all around her, she told the press what she had told the police the day before.
She was covered in bruises, she had stitches above her eye. She looked like she'd really been beaten up.
We were just followed and chased along the lanes. It was a case of both Lee and the other person were like playing cat and mouse with each other.
She ended with an appeal for the driver of the car to come forward.
Whoever this person is that was with you, you obviously know him, but he's ruined my life and he's ruined the lives of Maureen and Ray. And please just tell us who he is. She's
very tearful and she begs, you know, anyone with evidence to come forward, and it appears an extremely tragic case. She looks like a young lady who's lost the man she was going to marry.
Within 24 hours of Tracie's public appeal, West Mercia police were flooded with calls from all over England.
There were people coming forward saying, I saw this car, I saw that car, I saw this individual.
One by one, every lead was investigated, and every one led to a dead end.
It seemed they were drawing a blank. Nothing or no one seemed to fit.
On Wednesday morning, Detective Russell paid Tracie a visit at her mother's house. She'd been staying there since the night of the attack.
It would have been as my role as their contact, the family's contact with the investigation, making sure that she was okay, seeing how she was in terms of trying to get more information from her.
Tracie's mother met him at the door and took him to Tracie's room. When she didn't answer his knock, Detective Russell went in and found her half conscious on the bed. He immediately called for an ambulance.
I was concerned that she had taken an overdose.
He was right. And as Tracie was taken to hospital, Detective Russell worried that they might lose their only witness to a savage murder.
We needed her, selfish as it sounds, we needed her to be alive to make sure that we could catch the person who committed the murder.
Tracie survived, but her suicide attempt made headlines around the country.
The public were sort of devastated for her because it looked like, you know, she couldn't stand to live without her fiancé.
But within a few hours of her suicide attempt, the police suddenly had reason to wonder, was it really an act of grief? Or did Tracie Andrews have another reason for wanting to end her life? On Wednesday afternoon, West Mercia detectives finally received the phone call that would lead to a break in the case.
The chap knew the car, and when he saw it in the paper, he got in touch to say, I saw that car.
So what made this particular call stand out? For starters, the car the caller remembered wasn't the Sierra. It was Lee's Escort.
He was quite a bit of an aficionado on Ford Escort, strangely enough.
According to what the caller told the police, on the night of the murder, he and his girlfriend had been sitting at a T-junction waiting to turn when Lee's Escort had shot past them.
And they record him stopping, putting the car into reverse, and then sort of reversing to the junction they were at and driving past them on the opposite side of the road.
It fitted perfectly with what Tracie had said in both her original statement and when the detectives had re-driven the route.
She'd given clear and specific directions on that route. This is where we overshot the junction.
But then, after corroborating much of what Tracie had told the police, the couple's statement took its own sudden, unexpected turn.
They were able to tell the investigation there was no other car there.
There was no vehicle coming along that section of road pursuing that Escort whatsoever.
According to Tracie, the killer's car had been in hot pursuit when they'd missed the junction. Had she made a mistake? Or had she lied? Either way, the couple's statement brought Tracie's entire story into question.
It was the first challenge in evidence. That was the first part of her account that didn't correspond. She had to be considered now as a suspect.
On Wednesday, the 4th of December 1996, 27-year-old Tracie Andrews was in hospital for the second time in 3 days. The first time she had been treated for shock after the brutal murder of her fiancé in what the press described as the road rage murder.
But this was really the first time it appeared an angry incident on the road had led to somebody being murdered. And I think it frightened people, you know, it struck a chord.
This time, however, it was Tracie's life that was in danger.
She had taken an overdose, and I understand it was quite a bad one.
While recovering at the hospital, her fiancé's parents were among her first visitors.
I visited her most days at the hospital. She was still full of like the drugs and feeling the after effects of the overdose that she took.
At one point, a groggy Tracie grabbed Maureen's hand.
And she squeezed it and she said, I'm sorry. She said, I'm sorry for what I've done. My husband's nudged me and he said, that's the news you're going to get, to a confession.
To Lee's father, Tracie's apology amounted to her taking responsibility for his son's murder. But Lee's mother reserved judgment, telling her husband not to jump ahead of the police investigation.
I said, no, let's just wait. Let's see what happens. Let the police do the work.
Little did Maureen know that the police were beginning to come around to her husband's way of thinking. The same day that Tracie attempted suicide, 2 witnesses had come forward who had seen Lee and Tracie's Ford Escort just moments before Lee's murder. But it wasn't so much what they had seen as what they hadn't that concerned investigators.
There was no vehicle chasing that Escort.
And that then cast doubt on everything that Tracie had said about a pursuit, about a road rage incident.
Was their key witness also their prime suspect? Detectives went back over Tracie's statement, comparing it with all the evidence gathered to date.
We had an open mind. It could be that we were wrong. Maybe Tracie was really innocent. We were always ready for that possibility. But actually, as the evidence developed, it never pointed away from her. It just seemed to strengthen against her.
For one thing, as Tracie had described it, she'd been on the ground, knocked down by the other driver, when Lee was stabbed. And she'd only reached him after his attackers had gone, getting blood on her clothes by cradling Lee in her arms as he died. But the more the police studied the evidence, the more it indicated a different scenario. According to the forensic pathologist who'd examined the evidence from the crime scene, the distinctive pattern of blood on Tracie's top could only have come from an arterial spray.
Lee had a severed carotid and jugular vein, so he would have been spurting blood.
It's like a fountain, but very short-lived because so much blood is expelled at such velocity that the human body loses a lot of its blood content very quickly.
It sprayed out until the pressure went down. It was about 60 seconds.
But if the spray of arterial blood only lasted 60 seconds, how could Tracie have got it on her top if she'd only rushed to Lee's aid after the killer's car had sped away?
Her account to the police of when she actually went over to the victim after he'd been attacked by someone else was well after that arterial spraying would have subsided.
She clearly was closer to that than she indicated.
Taken in conjunction with her discredited story of the pursuing Ford Sierra, the implications were obvious to the police. A mysterious man didn't murder Lee. Tracie did. By Friday morning, the Crown Prosecution Service agreed with the police. They had enough evidence to arrest Tracie on suspicion of murder.
You rely on your witnesses, you rely on your forensic investigation, you rely on your timings. Once that picture was starting to be built, she didn't have much of an escape route, really, and it was all closing in around her.
But one thing was missing: the murder weapon. In addition to wounds from a blade, the autopsy had also revealed small double pricks on Lee's skin.
What's the sort of weapon that can both have a blade and have scissor points?
The police suspected that he'd been stabbed with a Swiss Army knife.
We did extensive searching for the weapon, covered or ground on both sides of the road for quite an extensive area.
A lot of rubbish was recovered, but never recovered the murder weapon.
Would the missing murder weapon prove fatal to the prosecution's case?
And we had to have an explanation. How did she get rid of it?
Detectives pored over the forensic evidence, hoping to discover how Tracie had got rid of the knife. But would they find it in time for the trial? The police appeared to be confident.
Detective Superintendent Johnston made the decision that she would be arrested on suspicion of the murder.
At around 11 a.m. on the morning of the 7th of December 1996, police officers met Tracie Andrews with handcuffs and an arrest warrant as she left hospital.
The moment she's well enough, the police swoop and place her under arrest.
And it wasn't until she was sitting in the back of a police car that a startled Tracie learned she'd gone from potential witness to prime suspect.
Superintendent Johnston played his cards very close to his chest.
And as Tracie was transported to the police station, Superintendent Johnston called on Lee's parents and informed them of the arrest.
The jigsaw was coming together, and it was horrible. It was still horrible thinking that Lee had died at her hands.
Maureen Harvey could no longer deny the awful truth. But would Tracie? The detectives were hopeful that once confronted with the evidence against her, she would own up to the murder.
I wanted to go back to Ian Johnston and say, she's coughed it, boss, which is a term we use for a confession. She's rolled over and she's told us exactly what happened.
But when they got Tracie in an interrogation room, the chances of a confession didn't look good.
She had 2 solicitors present during the interview, 2 defence lawyers, sort of thing. Well, that's almost unheard of in British interviews.
But Tracie's team of lawyers didn't allow for much of an actual interview.
If the male solicitor didn't interrupt during the questioning, then the female solicitor did, and it made it very, very difficult.
Even when Tracie did get a word in, she didn't make the detective's job any easier.
She didn't actually say anything, really, when confronted.
Not that the detectives didn't try.
She was challenged regarding the accuracy and the truth of her account, and clearly the suggestion put to her that she was the person who stabbed him.
Tracie's story didn't change, even when detectives informed her that they had a witness who had seen Lee's car, but not the mysterious Ford Sierra that had supposedly pursued them.
Her story stayed the same even when confronted. It stayed the same.
Finally, one of the other detectives sitting in on the interrogation said something that seemed to get through.
He just sort of made a comment about, "This isn't going to go away, Tracie." She bowed her head, and she just gave off some signals that I thought, this is it, she's going to go.
Tracie asked to speak to her lawyer alone. They consulted for 45 minutes before calling the detectives back into the interview room.
I was quite sort of excited, you know, there was an air of expectation.
The detectives sat down, prepared to take a full statement. And they got one, just not the one they were hoping for.
She said, basically, I'm not going to tell you anything else. I'm sticking to my story. I'm sticking to the answers I've given you.
On the 1st of July 1997, 27-year-old Tracie Andrews walked into Birmingham's Crown Court, flanked by her mother and stepfather. It was 7 months to the day since her fiancé, Lee Harvey, had been stabbed to death, and Tracie was about to stand trial for his murder. Since the night of Lee's death, Tracie had maintained that her boyfriend had been killed in a random act of road rage. David Krigman for the prosecution conceded that Tracie's version of events was true in a way. Lee's death was the result of rage, but the rage had been Tracie's. And it had been sparked off by the same altercation that had left her bruised and battered on the night of the 1st of December, 1996.
Clearly something took place between them two in the vehicle, and he may well have lashed out and struck her with the back of his hand or that sort of thing.
Krigman claimed that the evidence would show that Tracie had struck back, but not with her fists.
It wasn't just one stab to the heart, it was 37 stab wounds.
The pathologist described the attack as frenzied because of the number of wounds and the location.
But what had launched Tracie into a frenzy on that particular evening? For an answer, the prosecution called several neighbours who testified to overhearing a loud argument between the couple hours before Lee was killed.
Throwing things at each other. I think the telephone had got thrown, the TV maybe had got thrown. They'd obviously been having a serious domestic dispute between themselves on that day.
They were already rowing on a sustained and very high volume level earlier in the day.
And the argument continued off and on until much later that evening, according to the testimony of witnesses who saw them at the pub.
For whatever reason, they'd gone out for a drink, and that clearly hadn't made the situation any better.
They sit in the pub and barely said a word to each other, and fellow drinkers could tell that all was not happy in the Tracie and Lee camp.
The prosecution then called the couple who'd seen Lee's escort moments before the murder.
They never saw another car.
So far, the evidence showed that only Tracie had motive and opportunity to kill Lee that night. But what about the means? If Tracie had stabbed Lee, why hadn't police found the murder weapon at the crime scene?
The knife had disappeared. It had completely evaporated into the ether.
Just before the trial, we're still racking our brains about how did she get rid of the murder weapon?
The answer, the prosecution claimed, was that Tracie hadn't ditched the murder weapon at the crime scene. She had done it at the hospital.
Once it's out with hospital waste, there's absolutely no chance of it being recovered.
How did Tracie apparently manage to smuggle the knife into the hospital with the crime scene crawling with police? The answer, according to the prosecution, lay in Tracie's boots. Or more specifically, the curiously shaped bloodstain inside one of them.
It fitted in size and shape. The Swiss Army knife that we're fairly, well, certain that she used.
That young woman sat in the kitchen one of the key witnesses after the event, sat with the police, sat in the hospital, sat with her family, sat with the nursing staff, with the murder weapon still on her.
On the 10th of July, Tracie's barrister began laying out his case. His first witness was Tracie Andrews.
She was quite calm and composed, and she spent 5 hours just trying to tell her version of events.
She was detailed, she was consistent, she was calm, she presented herself well.
She told the jury that she had never deliberately lied to the police, but the stress of the situation may have affected her memory.
She just brushed it off by saying, "I can't remember, don't remember that bit."
But what about the testimony that contradicted her account? How did Tracie answer the eyewitnesses who said there'd been no Ford Sierra chasing Tracie and Lee?
She said they must have been talking to each other. The woman had her eyes closed in the passenger seat. They missed it.
And when the prosecution asked Tracie if it was Lee who had left her face bruised and battered that night, she adamantly denied that he had even struck her. She told the jury their fight earlier in the day was nothing compared to the ones they'd had in the past, and none of those fights ended in murder. On the contrary, she and Lee had always come back together, stronger than ever.
They always made up. I think they enjoyed the making up as much as they enjoyed the arguing.
To illustrate her point, she told the jury about one of the most painful episodes in their relationship, the events surrounding her pregnancy the previous autumn. But she added a detail that shocked at least one person in the gallery: Lee's mother, Maureen.
They had a fight. She basically threw him out of the flat, and she decided she didn't want to be a single mother, so she had an abortion and then told everyone it was a miscarriage.
When I heard that she'd had an abortion and she hadn't had the miscarriage, now I just gasped and said, "Oh, the bloody liar."
And for the first time, Tracie's composure slipped.
She turned on me and she pointed and she went, "I want her out. I want her out of here now."
The judge let Maureen stay in the courtroom, but when it came time for Tracie's cross-examination, the prosecuting barrister seized the opening offered by her outburst.
He basically dissected her story piece by piece and showed how it couldn't have happened. And of course, I think she did the worst thing possible that she could in the witness box. He got her riled up, he got her angry, and of course that anger blazed. The jury could see that.
It became apparent in the way she answered that this was a woman who had the capacity to do something as brutal as that which she did.
On the 28th of July, both sides gave their closing arguments. It was now up to the jury to decide if Tracie was guilty or innocent of Lee's murder. On the morning of the 29th of July 1997, Tracie Andrews sat in Her Majesty's Crown Court in Birmingham, waiting to hear her fate. The prosecution had claimed that she'd stabbed her fiancé, Lee Harvey, to death during a heated argument that also left Tracie battered and bruised. Now it was up to the jury to decide, did Tracie do it? And if so, did her actions add up to murder?
The judge, as was his duty, said if they found that she in fact did kill him, then they were entitled to consider provocation, which in English law reduces murder to manslaughter.
After 5 hours of deliberating, the jury announced it had a verdict.
It was probably the longest 5 hours of my life.
As the jury came into the courtroom, Lee's parents weren't the only ones feeling the tension.
The court was just still for a moment. There was sort of electricity, because I don't think people were certain what the verdict would be.
The jury foreman stood up to read the verdict.
The court clerk says, have you reached a verdict? The foreman says yes, and the court clerk said, what's that verdict? And the foreman says guilty.
Tracie showed no reaction to the verdict.
She was sitting there with her head bowed, looking at the floor.
The judge gave her the only sentence English law allowed.
There is only one sentence for murder. Life imprisonment.
For Lee's parents, the verdict meant justice for their son.
And just sighed a sigh of relief and just hugged each other and just said, thank God it's over and we can put Lee to rest now.
But for many, even though Lee Harvey's murder was solved, Tracie herself remained a mystery. Why did she persist in the road rage story, even when the evidence was overwhelmingly against her?
If she'd have said, he hit me, it would have given the opportunity to say, I didn't really, I was acting in some form of self-defence, and we may have been looking at a trial, but we may have been looking at the issue, is it murder or manslaughter?
She was a fool, because if she'd admitted that they'd had a row and it went horribly wrong, she probably wouldn't have done the life sentence that she's doing now.